They laughed when Robert Hayes raised his bidding card, not out loud at first, just that low, knowing chuckle men make when they think they're watching someone seal his own fate. The kind of laugh that says this won't end well, because by March of 1979, everyone in that muddy auction yard already believed they knew how farming stories like this ended, especially stories involving old red tractors that should have been scrap metal years ago, and Robert knew they were laughing at him because he'd heard it before. He'd heard it in feed stores, in church parking lots, in the quiet pauses when conversations stopped as he walked by. But this time it was different, because this time he was standing alone near the back of an estate sale for a man named Frank Dietrich, a farmer who'd worked the same Kansas ground since 1923, and now his life's tools were being sold off one by one to whoever still wanted them, which by that late Saturday afternoon wasn't many people. Most of the serious bidders had already left with the shiny machines, the newer equipment, the tractors that still looked like money, and what remained was what everyone politely called leftovers, though no one really meant polite when they said it. And when the auctioneer called out Lot 47, a 1951 Farmel M, runs but needs work, silence rolled through the crowd like a hell breath. The tractor sat half-sunken in spring mud, its red paint faded almost to pink, one rear tire flat, weeds threading through the cultivator mounts looking exactly like what the dealers like to call a time bomb. And the auctioneer tried again. For 100 to start, folks, this one still runs, needs a little love, but it's got work left in it. And that's when the first laugh came, then another. A joke passed between two men in clean boots and pressed shirts wearing John Deere caps, the kind of men who didn't get mud on their cuffs even at farm auctions. And Robert felt it before he heard it, that familiar tightening in the chest, not shame exactly, more like recognition, because he knew what they were thinking. Another. Old Farmel, that Hayes guy must be desperate. And when the auctioneer dropped to 300, Robert raised his card without hesitation, not dramatically, just steady, like he'd done 100 times before. The auctioneer nodded. 300. I've got. Do I hear 350? And when no one answered, when the crowd stayed quiet, the gavel fell. Sold to bidder 92 for $300. And as Robert walked toward the cashier's table, receipt in hand, he passed close enough to hear one of the Deere dealers say, not even bothering to whisper, "That's the guy. Hayes bought another old Farmel." And the other laughed. Another one. "How many pieces of junk is he running now? 2, 3? I don't know. He doesn't compete. He barely survives. Give him a few more years and he'll be having one of these sales himself." And they laughed again. But Robert didn't stop, didn't look at them, didn't say a word, because this wasn't the first time people had predicted his end, and by 1979, he'd already lived long enough to know that most people confuse noise for certainty, and that the loudest voices are often the least patient with time, and time, more than anything else, was what Robert trusted, though that trust hadn't come easily, and it hadn't started with confidence. It had started with numbers, because 6 years earlier, long before anyone laughed at him for buying his second or third Farmel, Robert Hayes was just another 31-year-old man, trying to make a living on borrowed dirt in southern Kansas, farming to 180 acres he'd managed to buy in 1968 with money saved from construction work, and custom harvesting, no family land, no inheritance, no safety net, just a small house, a stubborn work ethic, and one used tractor. A 1953 Farmel Super M he'd bought for $1,200 and rebuilt himself over to long months of evenings and weekends, tearing the engine down, replacing seals, learning every sound it made, every quirk, every weakness, until it ran tight and true. And for 5 years that tractor did everything he asked of it, planted, cultivated, harvested, never fancy, never fast, but dependable in a way that made sense to a man who measured risk in sleepless nights instead of horsepower. And by 1973, when a neighbor decided to retire and lease Robert another 160 acres, bringing his total to 440, the pressure began to change, not all at once, just enough to make him feel it in his shoulders and his calendar. One tractor meant longer days, tighter windows, less margin for weather, And everyone around him already knew what the solution was. Supposed to be, you go to the dealer, you trade. In the old iron, you finance something newer, something bigger, something with more capacity. That's how you grow, that's how you keep up, that's how modern farming works. And Robert heard it everywhere, at the co-op, at the feed store. From salesmen who smiled too easily and talked about monthly payments like they were weather. Forecasts instead of promises that followed you home. But instead of walking into a showroom, Robert went home and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator. And for a full week he ran numbers, not just the kind you tell a banker, but the kind you tell yourself late at night when no one's listening. If he traded the Super M and financed a 5-year-old John Deere for 1,020, payments would run around $300 a month for 5 years, $18,000 total with interest, plus higher insurance, plus the risk that when something broke, and something always broke, it wouldn't be a weekend fix with a wrench and a manual. It would be a dealer call, a wait, a bill, and a loss of time he couldn't afford. Or he could do something else. He could buy another old Farmel for under $1,000, put a few hundred into parts, invest his own labor, and own it outright, no payments, no interest, no one else with a claim on his future. And when he explained that plan to his wife Linda, she didn't laugh, she just asked, "You know, people are going to think we can't afford better." And Robert told her the truth. Let them think what they want. We're farming for us, not for them. And in the summer of 1973, while others were signing papers, Robert bought a 1949 Farmel M for $900 from a farmer upgrading to newer equipment. Spent 3 weeks rebuilding the carburetor, replacing the clutch, rewiring the electrical system. And when he finished, he had 2 tractors that could handle for 140 acres. And he didn't owe anyone a dime. And people noticed, not always kindly. "Hayes is farming like it's 1950, they said. Can't afford modern equipment. Going to work himself to death with those old machines." And the dealers noticed most of all. Because farmers like Robert were bad for business. They didn't participate in the upgrade cycle. They didn't depend on dealer service. They didn't believe that efficiency was worth any price. And when one salesman said within earshot that those old Farmels were time bombs that would nickel and dime him to death, Robert didn't argue, because arguing requires believing the other person is open to being wrong. And then October of 1973 arrived, and with it the oil crisis. Diesel prices tripled almost overnight, and suddenly the math everyone had been ignoring became impossible to avoid. Big tractors burned 50, 60, 70 gallons a day during peak season, and at the new prices. That kind of efficiency came with a cost that no one had planned for, while Roberts to Farmels, with their smaller engines and simpler designs, drank fuel like men who knew there wouldn't be a refill. His costs went up too, but not enough to break him. And then 1974 came, and 1975, and wheat prices crashed while input costs stayed high. And farmers who'd been fine on paper were suddenly underwater in reality. Because payments don't care about markets, and banks don't care about weather. And between 1974 and 1976, 7 farms in Roberts County went under. Good farmers, hard workers, men who'd done exactly what the experts told them to do. Expand, modernize, finance efficiency. And Robert watched the auction notices go up. Watched equipment he recognized roll across the same muddy yards he'd stood in years earlier. Watched families pack up lives that had taken generations to build. And he felt sick, because he knew how thin the line really was. And he knew, deep down, that the only difference between him and them was debt. When their income dropped, they couldn't make payments when his income dropped. He tightened his belt and kept going. And somewhere in that stretch of years, without ceremony, without speeches, Robert made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would never finance equipment again, not new, not used, not ever. If he couldn't pay cash, he wouldn't buy it. And by the time he stood in that auction yard in 1979, buying a 3rd Farmel for $300 while dealers laughed behind his back, he'd already been farming 6 years under that rule, 6 years without equipment payments, 6 years of fixing his own machines, 6 years of learning that survivability didn't look impressive. It just looked quiet and the men who laughed. That day didn't see the weeks Robert would spend in April and May, bringing that 1951 farmel back to life. Didn't see him working evenings after field work, weekends, early mornings before dawn, pulling the engine, rebuilding the top end, replacing bearings, cleaning points, rewiring the charging system, hunting used tires at salvage yards, spending $80 here, $40 there, painting it just enough to look respectable. And by the time wheat harvest rolled around, Robert had $500 total in that tractor, and it ran like it had when it left the factory, and 3 tractors lined up in his shed now, none of them worth bragging about, all of them paid for. And while his neighbor Greg Patterson wrote checks every month on $40,000 of tractor debt, Robert paid nothing. But what no one could see yet, what even Robert didn't fully grasp at the time, was that something bigger was building beneath the surface, that the forces which had already taken 7 farms weren't finished, that the pressure was about to increase, that the next phase wouldn't just test farmers' balance sheets, but their identities, and that the laughter he heard in 1979 was only the beginning of a much longer reckoning, one that would force an entire generation to choose between looking successful and staying alive, and that choice, once made, would never stop demanding its price. And that is where the story really starts, not with a tractor, not with an auction, but with a system about to reveal who it was built to protect and who it was built to break. By the winter of 1979, the laughter had already faded into something quieter and more dangerous, because laughter is easy when times are good and explanations are simple. But what followed didn't arrive with jokes or raised voices. It arrived with envelopes, with bank letters folded too neatly, with conversations that ended early, with men staring at kitchen tables long after supper had gone cold. And Robert felt the shift before most people named it, not because he was smarter, but because he had already learned what payments did to a man when margins thinned. He had watched it in the mid-70s when oil jumped and wheat fell, and the ground didn't care how modern your tractor was. And by the early 80s, the same pressure returned, only heavier, more patient, like a hand on the back that didn't shove you right away but never let you straighten up either. And everywhere Robert went, the talk changed, less about yields and more about notes, less about weather and more about restructuring. Farmers who used to compare acres now compared interest rates. And the men who sold equipment started talking about loyalty programs and service plans the way pastors talk about faith, and Robert kept doing what he had always done, which looked, from the outside, like stubbornness, but inside felt more like staying small enough to breathe. Because the thing no one tells you when they talk about growth is that growth comes with a sound, a constant hum in your head, the sound of money owed, and once it starts, it never turns off. And Robert had learned, somewhere between rebuilding engines and counting fuel receipts, that silence had value, that the absence of a bill could be worth more than the promise of efficiency. And so while others signed, he fixed, while others upgraded, he maintained, and while others slept lightly, he slept the kind of sleep you only get when no one can call a note due in the morning. But the cost of that silence was social, because people don't just leave you alone when you choose differently. They watch you, they wait. They expect you to fail so they can feel better about the risks they took. And Robert felt that waiting in small ways, in the way conversations shifted when he walked into the co-op, in the looks he got when he pulled up in an old truck with dust on the dash and grease under his nails. And the pressure came not as an argument, but as repetition. The same lines delivered over and over until they sounded like truth. You can't compete like that anymore. The industry's changed. You need scale. You need leverage. You need technology. And Robert didn't argue, because arguing would have required explaining something most people didn't want to hear, that competition wasn't the game they thought they were playing, that survival wasn't measured in acres but in endurance, and that the only people who never talked about downside were the ones who got paid before harvest. And as the 80s unfolded, that downside began to show itself again, this time sharper, because the debts were larger and the machines more complex and the margins thinner. And Robert watched good farmers get trapped between loyalty and obligation, stuck with dealers they'd known for years, banks they'd shaken hands with, agreements that felt reasonable, when prices were high and unforgiving when they weren't, and he watched auctions return to the county calendar, watched families sell equipment that still had years left in it, just to clear space on a balance sheet that no longer balanced. And in those years, Robert didn't feel triumphant. He felt heavy, because surviving while others fell didn't feel like winning. It felt like carrying a knowledge no one wanted to hear. And then in 1984, a young farmer named Scott Brennan came looking for him. Not because Robert advertised himself as an expert, but because word had spread quietly that Hayes was still there, still farming, still paying cash. And Scott stood in Robert's machine shed looking at the old farmers lined up, their paint worn, their seats cracked, and said what everyone said at first. Everyone's telling me I need to buy new, or at least finance something newer. They say I can't compete with this stuff. And Robert didn't answer right away. He kept working, replacing a hydraulic line, because he'd learned that answers landed better when they weren't rushed. And finally he asked Scott a question instead. Compete with who? The big operations, Scott said. The guys farming thousands of acres. And Robert tightened the fitting and stood up and wiped his hands and said the thing no one else had told Scott yet. You're never going to outproduce them, not on 100 acres. And Scott's face fell, because no one likes being told the race is already lost. But Robert wasn't finished. You can outsurvive them, he said, and Scott frowned, because survival didn't sound like a plan. And Robert pointed to the tractors and said something that would follow Scott for years. These aren't worth $10,000 combined if I sold them tomorrow. But they don't owe anybody anything, which means I can farm through bad years. I can handle low prices. I can handle weather, because my overhead doesn't eat me alive. And Scott listened, not convinced yet, but curious. And Robert told him about the farms that had gone under, 19 in the last decade. Every single one carrying debt they couldn't shed when markets turned. And he told Scott what the dealers wouldn't. That leverage makes you look strong right up until the moment it makes you brittle. And Scott left with more questions than answers, which was the right place to start. And over the next months, he followed Robert's advice, bought old equipment for cash, learned to fix it, learned to wait, learned to live with less shine. And 10 years later, Scott owned his farm outright and was leasing more land while the dealer who told him he couldn't compete had closed his doors. But those kinds of results never make headlines, and in the meantime, the industry kept moving, kept promising salvation through scale, and by 1990, Robert had been farming for 22 years, had weathered oil shocks, price crashes, droughts, hailstorms, and everything else agriculture could throw at a man, and he was still there, still working his original acres plus leases, still running old equipment that most people said shouldn't work. And the laughter had turned into something else now, not respect exactly, but uncertainty, because it's hard to argue with someone who keeps showing up year after year. And the implement dealers noticed that too. Noticed that while customers churned through upgrades and financing plans, Robert never came in unless he needed parts. And when he did, he paid cash and left. No service contracts, no dependencies. And that independence unsettled people whose business depended on permanence of obligation. And the tension finally surfaced in 1993 at a county farm bureau dinner, the kind of event Robert usually avoided, but Linda had convinced him to go. And during the social hour before dinner, Robert found himself near the bar listening to a regional John Deere dealer named Phil Morrison talk about the future, about GPS guidance, variable rate application, data integration, about how farming wasn't what it used to be and never would be again. And Phil was good at it, confident, polished, selling a vision that sounded inevitable. And when a younger farmer asked about Robert, about how he'd been farming with old equipment for decades without it ruining him, Phil smiled the way men do when they're about to explain an exception. Robert's an outlier. Phil said, he farms small. He's not trying to maximize production. That's fine for him. But it's not scalable. It's not how modern agriculture works. And Robert took a sip of his drink and said quietly, that's also how you lose everything. And the group went silent, because no one expects the quiet man to speak first. And Phil turned and asked what he meant, and Robert said it again. Leverage and scale and borrowed capital. That's how most of the farmers in this county who've gone under in the last 20 years lost their farms, and Phil's smile tightened, and he said that was an oversimplification. And Robert asked him how many of the farms foreclosed between 1980 and 1985 had new equipment, how many had expanded on credit, how many followed exactly the strategy Phil was describing, and Phil didn't answer, because numbers don't argue back when they're right, and Robert said something then that would travel further than he knew. I'm not saying your tractors are bad machines. I'm saying the business model you're selling benefits dealers and banks more than farmers. Debt creates dependence, and dependence keeps customers coming back. And Phil said that wasn't fair, and Robert said maybe not, but it's true. And the room stayed quiet, because people don't like hearing the terms of a bargain they already signed. And Phil excused himself and walked away. And an older farmer raised his glass to Robert and said, "Well said." And that moment marked a shift, because from then on, Robert stopped being the guy everyone expected to fail and started being the guy people sought out quietly. The one younger farmers asked questions of when they were tired of being told. There was only one way to survive, and Robert shared what he knew: how to evaluate machinery, how to buy at auctions, how to fix what you owned, but more than that, how to think about cost and risk and endurance. And through all of it, he never claimed his way was for everyone, only that debt changed the rules of the game in ways most people didn't understand, until it was too late. And by the time he retired in 2005 at 63, leasing his land to a young farmer he'd mentored, the farmers were still running, the debts were still absent, and the system kept turning, promising the same things it always had. And years later, in a 2018 podcast interview, when asked to explain simply why his approach worked, Robert said something that cut through all the noise. Most farmers are trying to make as much money as possible, which sounds reasonable, but it's the wrong goal, because chasing maximum profit pushes you into debt and risk you can't survive. The right goal is survival and ownership and independence. And if you stay alive long enough, profit takes care of itself. And when the host asked if the old equipment was the secret, Robert said no. The tractors were never the point, staying out of debt was. And the last time all four of his farmers stood together was at a farm show in 2019, lined up not as museum pieces but as proof. And a young farmer stood there looking at them for a long time, before asking the question that had followed Robert his entire life. Everyone tells me I need modern equipment to make it, that old stuff can't compete. But you did this for 40 years, so what's the truth? And Robert smiled and said competition is the wrong framework. You're not trying to beat other farmers. You're trying to survive an industry that profits from keeping you in debt. And the young man nodded slowly, because understanding doesn't arrive all at once. And Robert ran his hand along the hood of the 1949 Farmall he'd bought for $900 50 years earlier, and said the dealers laughed when I bought my second old Farmall, and my third, and my fourth. They said I couldn't compete, that I was living in the past, that I'd be out of business in a few years. And he looked at the young man and said, I'm still here. Most of them aren't, and somewhere in that quiet truth, in that long stretch of time where nothing flashy happened, but everything important did, the real cost of the system finally became visible. And the next generation would have to decide whether they were willing to pay it, because the pressure to modernize, to expand, to borrow never stops. It just waits for the moment you believe. You can't say no, and that moment, Robert knew, was the one that decided everything. And the reckoning for those who couldn't resist it was only beginning. By the early 80s, the pattern had settled into something most people no longer questioned. New equipment meant progress, progress meant debt, and debt meant you were serious. And Robert could feel how deeply that belief ran every time he pulled into town with one of his old Farmalls rattling behind the pickup on a flatbed. Because people didn't just look at the machine, they looked at him, at what it said about his choices. And there were days, especially during planting and harvest, when those looks carried weight, because farming with old equipment didn't just cost time, it cost energy. And there were mornings Robert woke before dawn already tired, not from lack of sleep, but from knowing the day ahead would be long and unforgiving, knowing that if something broke, there would be no service truck coming, no loaner machine waiting, only his own hands and whatever parts he could make work. And it was in those moments, standing alone in the shed with the smell of oil and dust thick in the air, that the real test of his philosophy took place, not at auctions, not in conversations, but in silence. Because independence sounds noble until you're the only one responsible when things go wrong. And in the winter of 1982, things went wrong in a way that couldn't be ignored. The 1953 Super M, the tractor that had carried him from the beginning, finally needed a full engine overhaul. Not a quick fix, not a patch, but a complete rebuild. And there was no pretending it could wait. And Robert stood there one evening with the hood off, looking at the worn parts laid out on a bench, knowing that this would take weeks, knowing that the rebuild kit alone would cost $800, knowing that a dealer would happily sell him something newer on credit. And for the first time in years, he felt that familiar pressure creep back in, not fear exactly, but doubt, because doubt doesn't shout. It whispers. It asks reasonable questions. Questions like, how long can you keep doing this? What happens when you're older? What happens if you get sick? What happens if the weather turns and you don't have the capacity to recover? And those questions followed him into the house, where Linda watched him sit at the table staring at nothing. And she didn't tell him what to do. She just asked what he was thinking. And he told her the truth, that it would be easier to finance something newer, easier on his body, easier on his time. And Linda nodded, because she knew that too. But then she asked the question she always asked when decisions got heavy. What would it cost you to do that? Not in money, but in sleep, in peace, in control. And Robert didn't answer right away, because he already knew. And the next morning he ordered the rebuild kit and spent the winter rebuilding the engine himself. Every bolt torqued by hand, every part cleaned and checked, because the work wasn't just mechanical. It was a reminder, a reaffirmation of why he'd chosen this path in the first place. And by spring the Super M ran like it had when it was new. And there was no payment waiting behind it, no interest accumulating. Just a machine he owned and understood. And that understanding mattered more than people realized. Because while others depended on dealer diagnostics and proprietary parts, Robert depended on knowledge that couldn't be repossessed. And as the years passed, that knowledge compounded quietly, turning him into the man people called when they were out of options. When a machine was down and the dealer quote made their stomach turn, and Robert never advertised, never positioned himself as an expert. He just helped when asked, charged fairly, took payment in cash or favors or sometimes nothing at all. And in doing so, he saw the other side of the system up close, saw how men who'd financed efficiency now couldn't afford downtime, how machines designed to save time now demanded it, and how the stress of owing seeped into everything, into marriages, into health, into the way people talked about their work. And one of those men was Greg Patterson, the neighbor Robert had watched sign papers back in the mid-70s. Greg, who farmed hard and worked long and believed genuinely that modern equipment was the only way to survive. And on paper, Greg looked successful. New tractors, clean shed, expanding acres. But every month nearly $600 left his account just to service equipment debt. And when prices dipped or weather turned, that money didn't care. It left anyway. And Robert saw Greg age faster than the years required. Saw the way his shoulders slumped when he talked about finances. Saw the way conversations drifted toward stress instead of plans. And one evening, after a long day, Greg stopped by Robert's place, not to argue, not to compare, but just to sit on the tailgate and talk. And after a while he said something that stuck. I don't even know who I'm farming for anymore. And Robert didn't answer, because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. And as the 80s turned into the 90s, the industry's language shifted again. Now it wasn't just about horsepower. It was about data, about integration, about systems designed to optimize everything except the human running them. And Robert watched as complexity replaced simplicity, and with it, dependence replaced ownership. Because you can't fix what you're not allowed to understand. And the men who embraced that complexity did so believing it would protect them, believing it would make them untouchable. But the truth Robert saw, year after year, was that the more layers between a man and his work, the fewer options he had when things went wrong. And that truth played out again and again in small moments. A delayed part, a locked system, a service bill that couldn't wait, and each time, Robert felt more certain that his quiet approach, however unfashionable, was buying him something no amount of technology could: time, not time saved, but time owned, and that ownership extended beyond machines to decisions, because when you don't owe anyone, you can choose to wait, to plant less, to skip an upgrade, to weather a bad year without panic. And that flexibility was what allowed Robert to take on more leases when others had to let land go. Not because he was aggressive, but because he was solvent. And by the time Scott Brennan returned to see him years later, older now, steadier, having followed the same path, having built a small operation on paid-for equipment, Robert saw confirmation not of his own wisdom, but of a principle that worked when respected. Keep your costs low enough that survival is possible. And Scott told him how people laughed when he bought old equipment, how dealers told him he'd never compete, how he almost believed them when the work got hard. And Robert recognized himself in that story, recognized the same moments of doubt, the same quiet resolve, and it reinforced something he'd learned but rarely said out loud: that most people don't fail because they're lazy or foolish. They fail because they accept terms that make failure inevitable. And by the early 90s, Robert's reputation had shifted from curiosity to contradiction, because he existed as proof that the script wasn't mandatory, and that contradiction made people uncomfortable because it suggested choice where they preferred inevitability. And the tension that had been building for years finally surfaced in that Farm Bureau room in 1993, when Robert spoke up against the prevailing narrative. And while the confrontation itself was brief, its aftermath was long, because once you say out loud that the emperor might be naked, you can't unsay it. And people began to look at Robert differently, not as a holdout, but as someone who'd opted out deliberately. And that attention came with its own cost, because being seen as an example invites scrutiny, and Robert felt it in the questions he got, the expectations people placed on him to defend a philosophy he'd never meant to turn into doctrine. And he found himself repeating the same clarification over and over. This isn't about old versus new. This is about what you owe and who controls you. But nuance travels poorly, and by the mid-90s, as technology accelerated and consolidation tightened, the stakes grew higher, because the margins for error shrank. And Robert watched as farms grew larger and fewer, watched neighbors sell out not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And he understood then that the real conflict wasn't between tractors or eras, but between two ways of living. One built on constant expansion, the other on endurance, and endurance doesn't look impressive in the short term. It looks slow, it looks small. It looks like someone who hasn't kept up, but over time, it reveals itself as something else entirely: resilience. And by the time Robert reached his early 60s, still farming, still fixing, still sleeping at night, he knew that the story people told about success rarely included the cost of staying in the game, and that the cost was rising, and that the next generation would face choices even starker than his had been, because the systems were more complex and the pressure more relentless. And as he looked ahead, as he watched young farmers weigh decisions that would shape decades, Robert felt a responsibility he hadn't asked for, to say clearly what he'd learned quietly: that ownership wasn't old-fashioned, it was protective; that debt wasn't evil, but it was dangerous; and that survival wasn't a consolation prize. It was the foundation everything else stood on. And those beliefs, tested and reinforced over years of work and doubt and choice, were about to be challenged again. Not by laughter this time, but by something far more seductive: recognition. Because when a system starts to notice someone who refused it and survived, it doesn't always respond with opposition. Sometimes it tries to absorb them, to turn the exception into a story that proves the rule. And Robert could feel that pull beginning, even if he didn't yet know how far it would go, or how public the next confrontation would become. By the time Robert realized people were starting to listen, he also realized listening came with expectations, and expectations carried weight. Because when you survive long enough in a system designed to grind people down, you stop being invisible. And invisibility had been one of the quiet advantages of his way of farming. He could work, fix, decide, and rest without anyone asking him to explain himself. But after the Farm Bureau dinner in 1993, that changed, not overnight, not dramatically, just subtly, like a current shifting direction under a boat that's been floating the same way for years. And Robert felt it first in the questions. Farmers stopping him in parking lots or at auctions, not to tease or argue, but to ask, "What did you mean by that? What would you do in my position? How do you know when debt becomes too much?" And Robert answered carefully, because he'd never believed in one-size solutions, and he told them the same thing again and again, that his way wasn't a blueprint, it was a boundary, that the line he refused to cross was owing money he couldn't outwait, because time, more than yield or efficiency, was what saved you when things went wrong. And some nodded and walked away, and some went back to their dealers and signed anyway, because knowing something and acting on it are two different kinds of courage. And Robert understood that better than most, because he'd felt the pull himself over the years, felt it every time a salesman talked about comfort and speed, and how much easier things could be, and ease is seductive, especially when your body starts to remind you that it's not 20 anymore. And by the mid-90s, Robert's body did remind him, in the stiffness that lingered longer in the mornings, in the way his hands ached after long days of wrenching, and there were moments, alone in the shed late at night, when the thought surfaced uninvited, maybe it's time to make things easier, maybe it's time to let someone else handle the hard parts, and those thoughts didn't make him weak. They made him human, because endurance isn't the absence of doubt, it's choosing again after doubt shows up. And what always brought Robert back was the memory of those envelopes, those quiet foreclosures, those conversations that ended with men losing ground they'd spent lifetimes building, and the knowledge that ease bought on credit often came with a cost that arrived later, when you were least able to pay it. And so he kept going, kept farming, kept fixing, kept living within limits most people considered unnecessary, and over time, those limits became something else. A buffer, a cushion, a space where choices could be made without panic. And that space grew more valuable as the industry around him grew more brittle. Because consolidation accelerated, farms got bigger, fewer hands did more work, and the distance between decision and consequence shrank, and Robert watched as mistakes that once could be absorbed now became catastrophic, because when leverage is high, margin for error disappears. And he saw it in the faces of men who came to him for help, not with engines this time, but with decisions, asking if it was too late to slow down, too late to shed debt, too late to regain control. And Robert never told them what they wanted to hear. He told them what he knew, that the sooner you stop digging, the easier it is to climb out. But that climbing out is always harder than never jumping in. And some listened, and some didn't, because the system rewards momentum, not caution. And caution looks like weakness until the moment it looks like wisdom. And that moment came for more people than Robert could count, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone admitting they'd been wrong, just a sale here, a restructuring there, another name disappearing from the county rolls, and through all of it, Robert remained an anomaly, not because he was untouched by change, but because he'd structured his life so change couldn't corner him. And that anomaly eventually drew attention beyond the county, because stories of people who don't break where others do tend to travel, especially in industries built on cycles. And by the late 90s, Robert found himself being asked to speak, informally at first, a few words at a meeting, a panel, discussion here or there, nothing official, nothing paid, just a chance to tell his story. And he accepted some and declined others, because he never wanted to turn survival into a performance. And every time he spoke, he emphasized the same thing, that he wasn't anti-technology. He wasn't anti-growth, he was anti-fragility, and fragility, he explained, comes from commitments you can't escape when conditions change. And those words landed differently depending on who heard them. Younger farmers sometimes heard permission, older ones sometimes heard regret, and dealers often heard threat. Because a farmer who questions the inevitability of debt questions the foundation of an entire business model. And that tension surfaced again and again in subtle ways, in the way service contracts were framed, in the way financing options were marketed as solutions rather than risks. And Robert watched it all with the same quiet attention he'd always brought to engines, listening for the sound beneath the sound, the thing that told you where the real stress lay. And what he heard, increasingly, was strain. Not just financial, but psychological. Because when people build their identities around growth and scale, slowing down feels like failure. And Robert understood that too, because pride is one of the most expensive inputs a farmer can carry. And it doesn't show up on balance sheets, but it shows up everywhere else, in decisions made to avoid embarrassment, in upgrades purchased to keep up appearances, in risks taken not because they make sense, but because not taking them feels like falling behind. And Robert had learned early that appearances are costly, that the need to look successful can undermine the ability to be so. And as the years went on, that lesson only deepened, especially as technology advanced and complexity increased. Because complexity doesn't just require capital, it requires trust. Trust that systems will work, trust that support will be available, trust that rules won't change midstream. And Robert had seen too many rules change to place that kind of trust lightly. And so he stayed where he'd always been, close to the work, close to the machines, close to the decisions, and that closeness insulated him from shocks others couldn't absorb. And by the time he reached his early 60s, he began to think about what came next, not in terms of expansion or exit, but continuity. Because the question wasn't how to maximize the last years of his career. It was how to leave the farm in a state that didn't collapse the moment he stepped back. And that question brought him back to Scott Brennan, the young farmer who'd once stood in his shed unsure and skeptical, and now, years later, had built something solid of his own, something that could stand without constant infusions of borrowed money. And Robert saw in Scott a version of himself he could trust with the land, someone who understood that farming wasn't a race, it was a long negotiation with uncertainty. And when Robert finally retired in 2005 at 63, leasing his land to Scott, it wasn't an ending so much as a transition, because he didn't stop working, he just shifted, taking on mechanical jobs for farmers who needed help and didn't want to be trapped by dealer service, becoming the person you called when you wanted something fixed rather than replaced. And in that role, he saw even more clearly how the industry had evolved, how machines had become less accessible, how repairs had become more guarded, how ownership had become conditional. And those observations only reinforced what he'd believed all along, that independence isn't granted, it's built slowly, deliberately, often against the grain. And by the time Robert agreed to sit for a podcast interview in 2018, he'd had decades to think about how to explain his approach simply, because simplicity had always been his strength. And when the host asked him why his way had worked when so many others had failed, Robert paused, not for effect, but because he wanted to be precise. And then he said something that surprised people who expected a technical answer. Most farmers are trying to make as much money as possible, which sounds reasonable. But it's the wrong goal, because chasing maximum profit pushes you into debt and risk you can't survive. And the right goal, he said, is survival, independence, ownership, building something that can weather storms. And if you can do that long enough, profit takes care of itself. And when the host asked if the old equipment was the secret, Robert said no. The tractors were never the point, staying out of debt was. And that line traveled far, because it named something many people felt but hadn't articulated. And as it circulated, Robert noticed a shift again, not just in who listened, but in how they listened, less as spectators, more as participants. And that attention culminated in 2019, when Robert brought all 4 of his farmers to a farm show, lined them up not as antiques, but as working machines. And people gathered around, asked questions, climbed on, touched the steel. And for Robert, it felt strange, because these tractors had never been symbols to him. They'd been tools, means to an end. And now they were being read as statements, as proof. And late in the day, when the crowd had thinned, a young farmer stood there looking at them quietly, the way Robert used to look at machines when he was deciding whether they were worth the risk. And finally the young man asked the question that had followed Robert his entire life. Everyone tells me I need modern equipment to make it. that old. Stuff like this can't compete, but you did this for 40 years. So what's the truth? And Robert smiled, not because the question amused him, but because it mattered, and he answered the same way he always had. Competition is the wrong framework. You're not trying to beat other farmers. You're trying to survive an industry that profits from keeping you in debt. And the young man nodded slowly, because understanding doesn't arrive all at once. And Robert ran his hand along the hood of the 1949 Farmall he'd bought for $900, half a century earlier, and he thought about the laughter, the doubts, the years of work that no one saw, and he realized then that the story people told about his tractors wasn't really about tractors at all. It was about choice, about refusing to accept that there was only one way to live. And as he looked out at the crowd dispersing, at the younger faces carrying questions he recognized, Robert understood that the real test of his philosophy wasn't whether it had worked for him, but whether it could help others see the cost of the choices they were being asked to make, because the pressure to modernize, to expand, to borrow hadn't eased. It had intensified, and the stakes were higher now, because once independence is lost, it's rarely regained, and that realization settled in Robert not as pride, but as urgency, because the final reckoning of this story wasn't behind him. It was ahead, waiting in the decisions of people who hadn't yet felt the weight of what they were about to sign. And whether they would recognize the trap before it closed was still an open question. By the time Robert turned 81, the question he was most often asked wasn't about tractors anymore. It was about choice, because people eventually stop caring how something works and start caring why someone chose it in the first place. And Robert had lived long enough to see that shift happen again and again, first with machines, then with systems, then with lives, and he still lived on the same farm he'd bought in 1968, the same ground that had seen him start with nothing but determination and a willingness to be misunderstood. And every morning he walked out to the shop the same way he always had, slower now, yes, but steadier too, because when you live without someone else's clock hanging over your head, time doesn't feel like an enemy, it feels like something you're allowed to use. And the Farmalls were still there, not museum pieces, not polished symbols, but working machines, still running on the land leased to Scott Brennan, the young farmer who had once stood in Robert's shed unsure and skeptical, and now carried forward the same quiet principles. And sometimes Robert would sit and watch Scott work, not with pride exactly, but with relief, because relief is what comes when you realize that what you built won't collapse the moment you step away. And that knowledge mattered more to Robert than any number on a balance sheet ever could. And in 2018, when he agreed to speak on a farming podcast, he didn't do it because he wanted attention. He did it because the host asked a question that felt honest. Not how did you make it big, not what's the secret to success, but why did your approach work when so many others failed? And Robert took a long moment before answering, not because he was searching for something clever, but because he wanted to be accurate. And he said what he'd learned the hard way, that most farmers are chasing profit because that's what they're told matters. But chasing profit pushes you toward debt, and debt pushes you toward risk you can't control. And the real goal, the one people overlook, is survival, independence, ownership. Because if you can stay alive long enough, if you can keep control long enough, profit has a way of finding you without you having to chase it. And when the host asked if the old equipment was the key, Robert shook his head and said the tractors were never the point. The point was staying out of debt. The point was being able to say no, and that answer traveled further than Robert ever expected, because it named something many people felt but hadn't been able to articulate. And when people heard it, they recognized their own lives in it, recognized the tension they lived with every day, the pressure to expand, to upgrade, to keep up appearances even when the numbers didn't make sense. And in 2019, when Robert brought all 4 of his Farmalls to a farm show, lined them up side by side, it wasn't a victory lap, it was an invitation, an opportunity for people to see what time looks like when it's on your side. And farmers came from different places, some curious, some skeptical, some defensive, and they ran their hands along the hoods, climbed onto the seats, asked questions about parts and repairs, and Robert answered them all patiently, because patience had been the currency of his entire career. And late in the afternoon, when the crowd thinned and the noise faded, a young farmer stood there quietly, not talking, just looking, and Robert recognized that look because he'd worn it himself once, the look of someone standing at the edge of a decision that would shape decades. And finally the young man asked the question that had followed Robert since the beginning. Everyone tells me I need modern equipment to make it, that old stuff like, this can't compete, but you made it work for 40 years, so what's the truth? And Robert didn't answer right away, because some truths need space. And then he said what he always said, but with the weight of time behind it. Competition is the wrong framework. You're not trying to beat other farmers. You're trying to survive an industry that profits from keeping you in debt. And the young man nodded slowly, not because he fully understood yet, but because something in that answer felt solid, felt like ground you could stand on. And Robert ran his hand along the hood of the 1949 Farmel M he'd bought for $900 50 years earlier, the tractor that had started it all. And he thought about the laughter he'd heard when he bought his second old Farmel, and his third, and his fourth, the predictions that he wouldn't last, that he was living in the past, that he couldn't compete. And he thought about where those voices were now. How many of the dealers who laughed were gone? How many of the farms that chased scale had disappeared? And how quietly his own life had unfolded in comparison, without headlines, without accolades, without debt. And he understood then that the reason his story resonated wasn't because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary in a way people rarely see anymore. It was the story of someone who chose to own his choices instead of renting them, and who paid the price of that choice upfront in harder work and social pressure so he wouldn't have to pay it later in lost sleep and lost control. And as Robert watched the young farmer walk away, carrying that question with him, he felt the familiar mixture of hope and caution, because hope without realism is just another kind of trap. And Robert never pretended his way was easy or universal. He only knew what it had cost him and what it had given him in return. A life no one could take away, a farm that survived storms literal and economic, and a sense of peace that came from knowing that when things went wrong, and they always do, he had room to maneuver. And that room came from choices made long before the crisis arrived. And now, as he stood in the quiet of his shop, tools hanging where they always had, the Farmels resting nearby, Robert understood that the real lesson of his life wasn't about machinery or farming at all. It was about resisting the pressure to live faster than your foundations allow, about questioning systems that promise ease at the cost of autonomy, and about recognizing that survival isn't a consolation prize. It's the condition that makes everything else possible. And the question he left hanging, not just for that young farmer, but for anyone listening to his story, was simple and uncomfortable. Would you rather look successful for a while and live under someone else's terms, or would you rather own less, own nothing, and still be standing when the noise fades? Because that choice never announces itself. It just waits quietly for the moment you're ready to sign.